Hello, Tomasz.
Hello, Minagas. Hello, everybody.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we'll have a brief presentation about data backup of a cloud storage of a cloud usage as understood. And the screen is yours, so you can start.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much. So once again, good afternoon, actually, ladies and gentlemen. So as I was introduced already, thank you so much for that. Today, I want to focus on the topic of cloud in general. So we are going to talk about the cloud in terms of data storage, in terms of a disaster recovery location, but also about something that is becoming more and more popular. So actually utilizing the cloud as our primary site and how this changes the approach when it comes to data protection. And to be honest, from what we see with our customers, it's mostly the case that we are in the process of migrating to the cloud. Very rarely it happens that we only move to the cloud environments, that there's only Azure or only Amazon. Usually it's a hybrid environment with our on-premises data and cloud data, and we have to find this golden rule how to protect this data just to make sure that both of these environments are fully protected. So my name is Tomasz Turek. I'm an engineer in Veeam, and today I want to show you a bit of slides, a bit of drawings, and also a short demo just to present how easy it is to actually protect the data regardless of where it actually resides. So just to start with, the thing that cannot really, a Veeam presentation cannot really exist if we do not talk about the 32110, our golden data protection rule, which is especially important today because of, well, two things. One of them is because of the cloud, so the main topic of today. And second portion of it, or the second thing that has made this rule even more important in the recent years is the widespread adoption of ransomware, of any kind of malware within our environment. So that's something that we see increasing quite a lot. A lot of our customers are actually struggling with the attacks, some of them unfortunately successful. So having an air-gapped copy, having a copy in a different environment can be very beneficial for the data protection strategy. Now, if you think about it, if you think about the 32110 rule, it's not exactly a Veeam rule. This is applicable to absolutely any backup vendor. So even if you're not using Veeam, not considering Veeam, it's something that you should be aware of. And I will also, of course, discuss how we can join this particular rule with our cloud-based environment. So let's start with the three. So the three copies of the data. So the three copies, of course, means that we have the copy, which is our production data. So that's something that everybody has, right? There is usually the primary backup. The primary backup is something that most of us do, but in order to be completely safe, there should also be a secondary backup stored somewhere, right? So that's something that we have to keep in mind. Now, not to make things too simple, of course, those two backups should be kept on two different kinds of media. There's absolutely no point in storing both of our backup copies, for example, on the same storage array, or sending them both to a tape device, which is then migrated to the same safe, which can undergo, for example, the same natural disaster. We have to keep this data separated when it comes to the media where it's actually stored. And now this is the part where actually cloud comes in the first place. So one of those copies, in order to be, again, fully safe from any kind of disaster, should be sent offsite. Now, there is a difference if we're talking about the old approach. So our, let's say, legacy environments, our on-premises environments, and there is a difference if we're talking about the cloud. If we're talking about our on-premises environments, so of course we have some local servers, the cloud can actually be used as our offsite location. And it's a great offsite location because if we are talking about even a private cloud provider or a public cloud provider, that's usually a completely different authentication domain. It's a completely different environment, has completely different security. So having our own infrastructure infected by any kind of malware, having it affected even by a natural disaster, usually does not affect the data which is stored in the cloud itself. And this is simple. That's something that we are quite used to. But what happens if the cloud is our primary environment? This is where it gets tricky because a lot of us are actually migrating off to the cloud, and we believe that the cloud is pretty much the safest place to store data, which is not entirely wrong. I mean, cloud has an uptime which is pretty much unachievable for our local environment, so we can consider it very safe. They have different regions. They have geo-replication between regions. They're able to actually protect this data, make it highly available. But high availability is something that the cloud actually provides. It doesn't exactly provide you with backup capabilities. And if you think about it, if you are completely in the cloud, if, for example, Azure or Amazon or Google Cloud or any other cloud provider is your primary location, what is the offsite? The offsite can be, for example, a different cloud. So if you're an Azure user, maybe send your backups to AWS. If you are an AWS user, maybe send them to Google Cloud. If you do not want to diversify in terms of cloud providers, then remember that the offsite for the cloud is your local on-premises environment. So you actually have to store those backups locally. Why? If something happens to the cloud, which is improbable, but we have to be ready for the worst case scenario, you will have a local copy which is fully accessible to you. Now, there may not be a problem with the cloud provider. There may be a problem with your particular account. Maybe somebody gained access to this account. Maybe somebody changed the passwords. It's going to take you some time to actually recover your administrative access. Well, this time is usually way too long for business to continue without any impact. So you want to have the local copy of this data just to have this business continuity, just to be able to continue working on your production environment. Now, the cloud can also help us with an additional thing, which is very important. And this is where ransomware, again, is the number one reason why we introduced it. So keeping one of those copies offline, air-gapped, or in any way immutable. By immutable, we mean undeletable, if that's even a word, or unmodifiable. Now, of course, this can be achieved, for example, using warm storages. This can be achieved using tapes, but cloud pretty much gives us a native capability which allows us to do that. So if you think about an S3 compatible storage, there is a checkbox where you can actually enable immutability on the S3 storage, which means that if me as a Veeam administrator is trying to delete a backup which is flagged as immutable, S3 or Amazon or any other S3 object storage is going to tell me, no, that's not going to happen. This backup is immutable. We are not allowed to touch it. If ransomware attacks my storage and tries to overwrite it, so tries to encrypt it, again, it's not going to have access to my backup files. So thus my backup files are safe for whatever may be the disaster, whatever may be the reason of its failure. And of course, the last thing, verify your backups. Veeam can do that automatically for you. So there's absolutely no problem in having that fully automated, but that's not, let's say, the main topic of today. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is storing the backups in the cloud itself, because this is, I believe, the most common scenario that we see with our customers is actually utilizing the cloud storage as a disaster recovery or a secondary storage location. We don't want to invest in a secondary data center. We don't want to put storages, let's say, in a physically different location because it's more expensive to upkeep. We may want to use a public cloud provider. Now, with Veeam, what is actually available is that Veeam, of course, is still an on-premises solution. If you think about your local environment, we still write backups to your local on-premises environment. Why? Because if a disaster strikes, if there is something happening with your local machines, you are the number one place from where the data should be recovered. Because the data is local, because the data is on a very fast disks, it's going to give you the best RTO possible. But because of this long-term retention requirement, or because you may be hit by ransomware, because anything else may happen, we also allow you to actually automatically send backups to an offsite cloud-based location. And as of right now, we actually have a couple of cloud providers which are compatible. So basically any S3 compatible storage, it can be Amazon Cloud, it can be Microsoft Cloud, it can be IBM Cloud. Actually, quite recently, also Google Cloud was added as a provider, which basically means that any backup that you're sending to your local location can be automatically copied. Let's use Azure as an example. For example, to an Azure blob. So that way, because you already have two copies of this data, so you have the production copy, you have the primary backup, you have the secondary backup, you're already compliant with this 32110 data protection rule. And by sending backups to an offsite location like an Azure blob, you are pretty much ensuring that this data is going to be safe. Because again, authentication to an Azure blob is completely different than authentication to your local resources. It's completely different accounts, completely different passwords, different way of accessing this kind of storage. Second of all, we are talking block storage versus object storage. Most ransomwares attack block-based storages because they are the most common. Object storage is safer, let's say, maybe not by design. Actually, by design, it's also going to be true. But by default, we can assume that object storage is going to be safer than block-based storage. So not only you're separating the environments from the security perspective, you're also changing the way the data is stored from blocks to objects, which also requires ransomware to have any kind of understanding or knowledge of those different storages to be able to actually infect them. Now, what is also possible when it comes to automatically sending this data? So I'll actually move to my lab environment. Hopefully you'll be able to see it. Don't worry, it's not going to be too technical. But what I wanted to show you is that how easy it is to actually define such a policy. Now, if you create a repository in Veeam, and we're talking about cloud mostly, you can see that there is a separate object storage section which can be used by our customers, and this our cloud providers. Now, keep in mind, S3 compatible storage can be pretty much anything. It can be your local service provider if you prefer to keep data to use a local service provider. You can use one of the cloud providers as well. Now, if you're choosing such a repository, keep in mind that Veeam does some sort of a staging of the backup. So we can actually see this maybe in this particular repository. You can see that there are actually a couple different repositories to which we are sending data. So what Veeam is going to do, and it's all automated, so you just define it once, then you don't have to worry about it at all, is that our primary backup is going to be written to our local storages. In my particular case, in my particular lab, it's a block-based storage, which is attached to a Windows server. So as you can see right here, it's a Windows server. Then what's actually going to happen, and again, this is fully automated, is that Veeam is going to automatically copy all the backups to an Azure blob. So I'm sending data to the cloud, I'm copying all my backups to the cloud, and right now I'm already migrating my data to object storage. Now, depending on the policy, depending on whether your business is regulated or not, you may also want to keep a very long-term retention for your backups. So, for example, certain for example, financial institutions, medical institutions, insurances, they are required to store data for tens of years. You might not want to do it on a regular blob storage because it can become quite expensive over time. So what Veeam also allows you to do is keep historical copies. So we can actually copy historical copies to an archive tier blob. So archive tier blob, again, this is object storage within the cloud, but it's a lot cheaper to store data. We do not assume that you are ever going to recover anything, because with the public cloud, the idea is that storing data is quite cheap. Recovering data from object storage, that's where it gets a little bit more expensive. But if you're putting something in the archive tier outside of an audit or outside of a governmental agency which requires you to provide this information, most likely you're never going to access this data. This is just for compliance purposes. So that way, you not only have the backups on a very fast local storage, you also have them in the cloud, and you can also have them as a long-term retention within the cloud itself. Now, another thing, like I mentioned, there's also one more thing that can be achieved using the cloud, and if we're talking about S3 storages in particular in this case, so let's choose our S3 storage. Let's just add something. So hopefully this is going to be a region which we'll be using. And there will be one checkbox which allows us to enable this immutability attribute. Now, this immutability attribute, and this is going to be this particular checkbox right here. So as you can see, it's quite simple. It's just a checkbox that you have to select in Veeam. Using this checkbox basically means that anything you send to the cloud is going to be unchanged for the specific number of days. So if my backup is supposed to be immutable for 30 days, if I access it after 2 weeks, if I try to delete my backup file, the answer is going to be no. If I try to do it from the perspective of, well, in my case, I'm talking about Amazon. If I go to my Amazon admin center and I try to delete my bucket, the answer is going to be no, because there are files which are immutable. If I call Amazon support and I ask them, okay, could you please remove this for me? I'm the owner of this account. The answer is going to be no, because the backups or files or blocks, which are actually objects which are stored there, are immutable for a certain period of time. They have to expire to be able to do anything with this object storage. So whenever you're attacked, whenever you have an insider incident or you're attacked by malware, this gives you, let's say, 100% capability of making sure that the backups are recoverable. And this is actually also something that our customers have been using. And from what I've seen so far, all of our customers who have been sending data either to an Azure blob or to an AWS bucket had those backups recoverable in case of any kind of ransomware disaster. So even if all of the local infrastructure was encrypted, anything that was in the blob was still safe. And you can see right here, Veeam is aware of this object storage, so we can see this as a specific repository. And just to very quickly show you, not going into too many details, you can recover absolutely anything from, in this particular case, an Azure blob. So you can recover the entire machine, an individual file. Actually, this is my Exchange server right here. So I can even go and exchange and recover an individual email if I wanted to do this. So object storage does not limit us when it comes to recoverability of the data. Another very good thing, storing data in the cloud does not mean I'm not allowed to recover it to my local on-premises environment. So if I have vSphere, if I have Hyper-V, I can actually stream my virtual machine from the cloud to my local environment and have it up and running from the cloud. Of course, again, is it going to cost me money? Yes, from the cloud provider perspective. But if you are in a disaster situation, most likely this is not going to matter too much. So from the perspective of functionality, you get exactly the same thing as block storage. From the perspective of security, object storage gives you a lot more. Now, another thing about the cloud. Well, having a local environment is one thing. Local environments can go down. And we've all been through any kind of disaster. If we're talking about our company infrastructures or even home-based infrastructures, I cannot count the number of times either my laptop failed or my small storage array has failed. I mean, those things happen. So if my local infrastructure fails, if I have the backups, well, hardware has this very, let's say, major problem that it has to exist to be able to be usable, right? So if my servers go down, I need new servers to be able to recover my data. That might not be the case for 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. For example, my storage provider tells me, okay, I will bring you a new storage array in a week, because that's how long we have to wait for this to arrive. I don't have a week, so what I can actually do is I can take any Veeam backup which has been created, I can recover it directly to a cloud-based environment. Why? Because Azure or AWS, it's always there. Of course, they can have their downtime, but most likely you're not going to see it. Why? Because they will simply switch to a different region. Maybe it will run slower, but it will eventually run. And if you have some critical workloads which have to be recovered immediately, using the cloud is the simplest way to simply recover your virtual or physical machines. And I said virtual or physical without any, let's say, changes in between those two, because Veeam doesn't care what you do a backup of. So you can actually run a backup of a machine which is virtual. So this can be vSphere, this can be Hyper-V. It can be recovered as a cloud VM. It can be a physical laptop, for example, like my own personal laptop. No problem. I can recover it as an Azure VM, for example. I can do a backup of my physical server, like a SQL server, Exchange server. I can also recover this as my virtual machine running in an infrastructure as a service environment. And again, this is something quite simple. I will once more switch to the lab just to very quickly show you that it's a simple click in the interface. If you look at the backups which have been created here, so just to give you a rough idea, look at the icons. So this icon basically means it's a Hyper-V backup. This icon means it's a vSphere backup. So those are file-based backups. We don't really care about files. This is my physical Windows server. This is my physical Linux server. And in here, I actually have my SQL backup, right? So there are some transaction logs. Now, why I'm showing you this, because in a second, you will see every single one of those backups can be virtualized to the cloud directly. So I can take my Hyper-V backup, And you can see right here, I can restore directly to Amazon. I can restore directly to Azure. You do not have to prepare a VM in Amazon or in Azure. So this is something where we do the conversion on our own. Of course, you have to have the resource pools ready. Of course, you have to have the networking defined. You have to have storage accounts defined. But the conversion from a Hyper-V VM to an Azure VM, this is all done automatically by Veeam. So it's nothing that you have to worry about. All you have to do as an end user is have to choose the template. So the amount of processor, amount of RAM, amount of storage, which will be allocated to this machine. That's pretty much it. The rest is done on the fly. So this was a Hyper-V VM. Same thing if you're talking about a vSphere VM. So again, a different one, right? This can be recovered to any of those cloud environments. My physical Windows server, so there are slightly different recovery options on the top, but those two, they are still there. They can be virtualized without any problem. Another machine Azure, you have to, for example, recover your environment to AWS. It's still not a problem for us. So we'll come back to this. But for example, you can see right here, maybe I will do it this way. This is my Microsoft Azure virtual machine backup. So those are machines running in an infrastructure as a service model in Azure. I can take this backup and I can also recover it to a different cloud provider if I need to do it for whatever reason, right? So there's also this cloud mobility, which is enabled if one of the cloud providers that I'm using is for some reason, for example, not satisfactory for my infrastructure. So keep in mind that those two are supported for now. So Azure and Amazon to be basically the GCP, so Google Cloud Platform, to which you will be able to recover. So the three biggest, I believe, cloud providers that we are using in our region. So this mobility actually allows you just to move data between the cloud, between the on-premises environment, and make it quite simple. Now, coming back to the cloud environment as such, if you are already using infrastructure as a service environment, so basically we are talking strictly this particular case in Azure. Keep in mind that Microsoft has something called the shared responsibility model, where they directly tell you, dear customer, we give you high availability, we take care of the physical hardware, we take care of the uptime, but we do not really provide backup capabilities. Anything which is above a physical host is your responsibility, dear customer. We do not look into your virtual machines. We have no idea what kind of data is inside those virtual machines. So if you want to protect this data, it's pretty much on you. If something happens, so there is some sort of a physical failure, of course, there is geo-replication. Those virtual machines will start in a different region. Most likely, you will not even see any kind of downtime. However, if, for example, your virtual machines get infected by ransomware, so everything is encrypted, it's unusable from your perspective, keep in mind that what Microsoft sees is the same virtual machine, simply with a different block structure underneath. They do not look inside the virtual machine. They have no idea that somebody infected it with malware. They have no idea it was encrypted because they should not be looking at the data which you're storing inside the VMs. And now if region, it doesn't really matter that there is geo-replication, right? If you want to start this replica, it's also going to be encrypted. So it's not a backup solution, it's a high availability solution. So having a backup simply gives you the security that if something happens to the data, if something happens to the consistency of this data, you are able to recover the data to a particular point in time. And that brings me to actually the second to last thing. I will go back to my lab. So actually the capability of backing up virtual machines which are running in the cloud directly. So what you can actually see right here, hopefully, so let's do this in red, it should be visible a little bit better. We have something called the Veeam backup for Microsoft Azure, we have the same for AWS, we have the same for Google Cloud Platform. So all of the major cloud providers. So this piece of software is designed specifically to backup virtual machines running in the cloud. So you can see that there are some instances. Those are my virtual machines which are running in the cloud. I have a Linux machine, I have a Windows machine, and I have two ways of protecting those virtual machines. I'll very quickly show this to you, not to run out of time too much. So there are two ways of protecting my virtual machines. One of them, as you can see right here, are snapshots. Second ones are backups. Actually, this is going to be better visible in here. So what it means, if I have a VM running in Azure in this particular case, I can create an Azure snapshot. An Azure snapshot is extremely quick to create. It's extremely quick to recover the data, but an Azure snapshot can only be recovered to Azure, so no mobility. And it's quite expensive, and you will see this in a second. Or you can also create a backup. So basically you can create a Veeam backup, which is by default stored in a blob storage. And this backup is a regular Veeam backup. So it can be recovered back to Azure. It can be recovered, for example, to a different cloud, so maybe to AWS. It can be recovered to your local vSphere or Hyper-V environment. So we have this full backup mobility. And because it's stored on object storage, it's a lot cheaper to store this data. Just to give you an idea, Veeam has something called the cost estimation when you are creating such a policy inside the public cloud provider, just to give you some idea. And one thing to remember when we move to the cost estimation, we are keeping snapshot for 3 days and backup for 21 days. So we keep 7 times more backups than we keep snapshots. And we go to the cost estimation, and you can see the difference right here. Keep in mind, 3 days, 21 days, right? So again, snapshots are great because they're extremely fast. So keep 1 or 2 for those disaster recovery purposes. But if you're looking for long-term storage, just having a regular backup stored on an Azure blob or an S3 bucket or Google Cloud Platform object storage is the better way to go, and it's definitely a cheaper way to go. Of course, we also calculate the transaction costs, and we give you the estimated, again, let's change the color, we give you the estimated total cost of a backup inside the public cloud, because that's the biggest problem inside the public cloud. How much is that going to cost me? Keep in mind, it's not a cost that's associated with Veeam directly. It's something that has to be settled with the cloud provider themselves. And now this backup can be either recovered directly in the cloud itself. So I can actually go to my protected data. I have my machine. I can recover an entire machine here. I can recover individual disks. I can do a file level recovery if I want to do it, or I can do it from my on-premises environment. So like I mentioned, this external repository is the same piece of data which I saw just in my web-based interface. So now I can take this backup. I can recover it to my local environment if I want to. Again, individual files. I can export individual disks. I can change the cloud provider which will be used in this particular case. So that way I can just move this backup around however I want to do it. And of course, I can also download this backup locally should I wish to do so, right? Just to have the local copy of this backup. So there's something called the backup copy job. So backup copy job, again, of course, it just copies backups between 2 different storages. As simple as that. And there is an option to copy Azure backups, Google Cloud Platform backups, and AWS backups. And of course, I can point it to my local repository. And the very last thing I wanted to tell you is, again, the same thing about Office 365. Office 365 is still the cloud, and we still need to have a backup of it. And the one thing that I want you to remember about Office 365 is that backup of Office 365 does not mean you're stuck with Office 365. You can recover to Office 365, or you can recover to your local on-premises environment should you wish to do so. So again, migration of data between the cloud and your local on-premises environments if you want to do so, or if you're a business which is regulated and is required to do such things. So that's it from my side. Like I mentioned, quite a lot of things connected to the cloud. Feel free to try them out. So I believe Bluebridge can quite easily help you with implementation of all those things. But if there's one thing I want you to remember is that the cloud is a great solution. Just remember to have it secured as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tomasz, for your presentation. It was really interesting to listen. And question from my side. It looks like that Veeam covered all the aspects of a hybrid cloud, and if you want to have a hybrid infrastructure, even cloud infrastructure, and we're looking from the backup side. And but so, what would be the next challenge for Veeam in order with the backups and with the infrastructure?
So the next challenge, and this is something that's actually happening, is the container-based backup. So Kubernetes backup. So Veeam has acquired a company called Kasten, which is specializing in that. And we are moving into container backup because containers were something that everybody's looking into. Some of our customers are already using them, but it's not something that people were considering a backup of. And this is changing. People want to start backing up containers. So again, we want to provide the technology to do this securely and again with this mobility in mind.
Okay, so it is the next focus for Veeam. So at the moment, Veeam could not back up containers, yeah?
It's a quite recent acquisition, so we had this for less than a year, so to speak. So it's a very new product. Most of our customers are still testing it, checking if this is going to work. But yes, we can consider that this is going to be the nearest future for Veeam.
Okay, cool. So thank you one more time for your presentation and to being here. It was
Thank you so much.
Very interesting. I think you cover all the aspects of a Veeam, and the thing is kind of popular software for the replication and for a backup, and I believe it will keep a position.
Hopefully we'll stay there as this one point of contact for everything. Again, thank you so much for having me here.